When Mel Wiley became chief of police for Hinckley Township in northern Ohio, trustees felt satisfied they'd selected the right person. He'd been in law enforcement for nearly 20 years at that point, having worked for both the Medina County Sheriff's Office as well as the FBI. Surely, conquering the challenges of small-town Hinckley would be easy by comparison. For 3 years, that's how it was, until a quiet summer weekend when Chief Wiley mysteriously vanished. His car was discovered abandoned at Cleveland's Edgewater Park, and all of the evidence suggested that he may have drowned in Lake Erie. However, the longer investigators worked, the more they began to believe that perhaps Chief Wiley had planned his own disappearance in order to leave a lasting mystery. Were that his goal, he certainly succeeded, as more than 35 years later, he remains at the center of one of America's longest-enduring unsolved mysteries involving a police officer. Mel Wiley would go on to have the dubious distinction of becoming the first ever chief of police officially listed as a missing person by the FBI. While investigators were insistent that Mel did indeed plan out his own disappearance, those who knew and loved him struggled to accept that he would ever abandon his job, his home, and his family. Is this the story of a man looking to leave behind a legacy of unanswered questions, or was a more sinister hand at play? This is Trace Evidence, episode 215, The Vanishing of Chief Mel Wiley. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the baffling and mysterious circumstances surrounding the 1985 disappearance of Chief Mel Wiley. Before getting into the case, just a few quick notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, episode breakdowns, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions through the website or by emailing me directly at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. As a final note, this year, CrimeCon will be taking place in Orlando, Florida from September 22nd through the 24th. I'll be there representing Trace Evidence on Podcast Row, and I hope to see you too. Visit crimecon.com and use promo code TRACE to save 10% on your pass. That's crimecon.com, promo code TRACE. Chief Mel Wiley vanished nearly 40 years ago, and in all of that time, no trace of the man has ever been found. Did Mel Wiley choose to abandon everything and start a new life, or has someone gotten away with murder? This is episode 215, The Vanishing of Chief Mel Wiley. Hinckley Township, located in the northeast corner of Medina County, Ohio, sits just 25 miles south of Cleveland. A primarily residential community home to more than 7,000 citizens, it's for the most part a rural town with little flair or fanfare, but for one day of the year. Every March 15th, thousands converge on the small town to bear witness to the return of the buzzards. More than 200 years ago on Christmas Eve, 1818, residents of Hinckley gathered together to try and rid their growing town of predators who threatened both their crops and their lives. They called it the Hinckley Hunt. More than 500 hunters surrounded the town and made their way inward, shooting all the way. By the end, the tally of the dead totaled 17 wolves, 21 bears, 300 deer, and countless smaller animals and pests. 3 months later, the buzzards arrived, drawn to the town where there were still countless carcasses rotting in the woods and surrounding areas. Every March 15th on the dot, the buzzards have returned, continuing a natural tradition that has endured for hundreds of years. While these days the buzzards don't find much to feast on, they do arrive to a Hinckley ready to celebrate what they have since termed Buzzard Day. Showing, perhaps, that fate is not without a sense of irony, the town known for its clock-like return of the buzzards is also home to one of the longest unsolved mysteries involving a law enforcement officer in American history: the 1985 disappearance of Chief Mel Wiley. Melvin Lee Wiley was born on Friday, May 6, 1938, to parents Clark Wiley and Doris Baker in Lorain County, Ohio. At the time of his birth, Melvin's parents were not yet married, a detail about his childhood which always seemed to haunt him, this subconscious feeling that, even in birth, he hadn't done it the right way. Records from the 1940 census show that for at least the first year of his life, Mel lived with his mother and maternal grandparents. However, 2 years later, when Mel was turning 4 years old, his parents were officially married in the spring of 1942. The family moved into a home in the 1600 block of West 19th Street, less than a mile south from the shores of Lake Erie. Over the course of the next 8 years, the family would grow, with Mel becoming the older brother to 2 sisters and a younger brother. Friends and family described Mel as somewhat of a dual personality. Sociable, friendly, gregarious, and playful to some, quiet, reserved, and withdrawn to others. It seemed that, from an early age, Mel invited some into his circle, but kept others at arm's length. Regardless of how close someone was with him, Mel rarely spoke about himself, choosing to listen instead of sharing. In retrospect, many people who knew Mel both in his early days as well as his later years would describe a unique dichotomy. Mel was a deeply emotional person. He felt things much more than he'd ever share. And while he'd welcome friends into his life, he never fully opened the door. Those who knew Mel best have often commented that they knew only the side of him that he showed, but it was very clear that there was so much more going on behind his eyes. He just wasn't interested in telling the story, at least not out loud. When it came to his own thoughts and feelings, Mel preferred the safe sanctuary of the written word. From a young age, Mel fell in love with writing. Whether he was writing about himself, creating stories, or crafting poetry, writing became the true passion of his life. Often, over the years, Mel commented to friends and family members that he believed writing was the reason he was put on this planet. And while he dreamed of someday being a famous, successful author, the realities of the world into which he was born sent him down different paths. Beyond writing, Mel had a strong interest in music, mostly classical or big band style, which he indulged in, beginning his record collection early. Mel was also a lover of movies and trains. Trains were a big one, especially considering his familial connection to the rails. Mel's grandfather had worked for years as a telegraph operator for several different railroads, and his father, Clark, had been employed as an engineer with the Baltimore, Ohio Railroad. Mel's mother, Doris, would later note that one of his favorite activities as a child was to walk the short distance from their Lorain home to the Nickel Plate Railroad crossing, where he'd sit for hours on end just watching the different trains and rail cars pass by. Unfortunately, while the train connection may have played a role in initially forging a bond between Mel and his father, the environment inside of the family home was less than welcoming. Though Mel never said much about his upbringing, his parents would ultimately divorce, and following their separation, Mel would speak to his father just a few times over the next years until their connection completely faded out. As a teenager, Mel would go on to attend Lorain High School. During his time at school, Mel performed well academically and became involved in several extracurricular activities. In addition to being a member of the school's writing group, he was also a member of the student council, an usher, film operator, and associate editor for the high school paper. While it wasn't necessarily his passion, he began eyeing journalism as a potential career, since he'd be making money by writing, a good step toward fulfilling his dream. Mel graduated in the spring of 1956, 18 years old and with the whole world at his fingertips. Following graduation, Mel moved on to college, attending George Washington University in Washington, D.C. During his time in the nation's capital, Mel would be hired by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where he worked as a fingerprint technician. He'd stay in D.C. working for the FBI for 3 years, from 1957 to 1960, leaving when he turned 22 years old. Following this, Mel enlisted in the Army and was sent to the former Fort Ord, located in Monterey, California. Here, Mel would find himself completely enthralled by the Bay Area, with his particular interest focused on San Francisco, a place he would later describe as feeling like home. No information has ever been revealed about what exactly Mel did during his time in the Army, but we do know that his time is listed as lasting from 1961 to 1964. Fort Ord was but one location to which Mel would be assigned, with his duties carrying him through multiple states in the West. At one point, he was assigned to the Atomic Test Site in southern Nevada. While the nature of his duties at the site are unknown, it was in Nevada that Mel would seemingly become the victim of some type of accident or mistaken exposure to radiation. From that point forward, he stopped wearing short-sleeved shirts as his arms and part of his torso were covered with white patches of scarred skin from radiation burns. The timeline is somewhat confusing based upon where Mel was at different times following his service in the Army, but we know he went back to school, attending Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. After graduating from BYU, Mel returned to Ohio, where he settled in Medina, where his mother was living, 33 miles south of Cleveland. There, he was again hired by the FBI and worked as a fingerprint technician. However, his role would be somewhat expanded, as part of his new post with the FBI involved instructing police officers in different departments on how to properly and accurately take, examine, and compare fingerprints. We know for certain that Mel was brought in to teach these procedures to the Ohio State Police at one point. In addition to his role with the FBI, Mel also moonlighted as a small-time private investigator, likely drawing on his access to FBI tools as well as the training he'd received in the military. In 1965, at the age of 27, Mel finally began receiving some money for his writing. It didn't necessarily come in the form that he'd hoped, but it was a living. Mel was hired on as a crime beat reporter for the Medina Gazette-Leader-Post, one of the prominent local papers in the area. He would be charged with keeping up with local crimes and investigators, though in a small town like Medina in the 1960s, there wasn't a lot to try and keep up with. This work put him in a position to become closer with members of law enforcement, and his background as a former FBI employee added some gravitas to his resume. Less than a year later, Mel would be hired on by the Medina County Sheriff's Office, where he would be tasked with updating and reorganizing the department's structure around both fingerprint analysis as well as missing persons. While working at the Sheriff's Office, Mel would meet and befriend several people who would later play prominent roles in his life. In terms of his job, two of the most important names would be fellow deputies at the time, Len Keller and James Bigham. However, it was also during this time with the sheriff's office that Mel would meet and fall in love with Cynthia Manzer. The relationship evolved quickly, and on Monday, January 9th, 1967, the two were married by Judge Carol B. McClure at the Medina Municipal Court. Following the nuptials, the couple moved into the Heritage House Apartments in the 230 block of West North Street, Medina. Mel would continue living in the same apartment until the very day he vanished. For the next 10 years, Mel worked for the sheriff's office and continued to write for the Gazette. Many of his old articles are available through newspaper archives and cover a wide variety of topics from local interest to police matters to big band music and everything in between. Not only was Mel's name showing up in the papers, listing him as the writer, but he was making news as a deputy sheriff as well. Several articles regarded Mel highly, noting how his quick thinking and fast responses helped lead to a drug bust in one instance and saving the life of another officer in a different instance. After 10 long years working for the sheriff's office, Mel would accept an offer for a change of scenery. In 1967, former Deputy Len Keller was hired on as the chief of police for the Hinckley Police Department. Hinckley is a small unincorporated community just 10 miles northeast of Medina. After moving from the sheriff's office to the Hinckley PD, Keller reached out to Mel, who he would hire on as his sergeant. This would have Mel rounding out the entire department by becoming the 6th officer working in Hinckley. For the next few years, things seemed to move along well. Mel took on more duties at the department, continued writing for the paper, and spent his free time with his wife, Cynthia, and their cats. The couple would take multiple trips and vacations over the years, though Cynthia would later note that an Amtrak trip to California, and specifically San Francisco, was always Mel's favorite. 6 years later, in the spring of 1982, there would be a dramatic shift within the department. Chief Keller weary of politics and frustrated with the lack of funding for a department he was expected to grow, decided to resign. The town trustees, who appoint the chief, were completely caught off guard and acknowledged that while Keller had spoken of moving on, they didn't know he was going to just drop it on them without notice. As a result, Mel, who by this point had obtained the rank of lieutenant, was appointed by the trustees to replace Keller as chief of the Hinckley Police, and Mel enthusiastically accepted. Not only was this a position which would give him a higher level of prominence in the local community, it paid far better, and with the position being more administrative and not out on patrol, he'd have much more time to work on his writing when he didn't have more pressing matters to attend to. Unfortunately, while things were going well for Mel in his career, his personal life would be another story. On Friday, October 7th, 1983, Mel's younger brother Clark, with whom he was exceedingly close, lost a battle with cancer. He was just 38 years old. For a man like Mel, who many said kept his emotions to himself, this was an extremely difficult time and one of the rare periods during which Mel outwardly expressed his pain. Mary Kirby, co-owner of one of Mel's favorite daily spots, K&K Donuts, became close with him over the years. For her, the death of Clark was the first time she'd seen Mel without his usual smirk and smiley attitude. Mary would later tell the Los Angeles Times, quote, "He cared for his brother deeply. That was the only time I've ever seen him close to breaking down." End quote. According to friends and family, Mel didn't start to seem like himself again until approximately a month after the passing of his brother. While he was back on his feet and moving forward once again, his personal life would take another hit. Cynthia, his wife of 18 years, moved out and filed for divorce. In January of 1984, the divorce was finalized and Cynthia moved out of Ohio, returning to her native New York. Since the couple had no children, did not own a home, or have a mortgage, the process was completed fairly easily. In the end, Mel had to pay alimony to his ex-wife, and he continued to live in the apartment they had shared for the previous 18 years. The divorce hit Mel hard, according to friends and family. Following on the heels of the loss of his brother, it seemed for a moment that his entire world was crashing down around him. While the loss of his brother had resulted in more than a month of grief, depression, and pain, the dissolution of his marriage was another punch to the gut. Mary Kirby noted that it was a really bad time when Mel was divorced, and it took him months to come around. Carol Kozman, co-owner of the donut shop, agreed, telling the LA Times that she had never seen Mel in such a depressed state. Suffice it to say, it was an exceedingly difficult time for the 45-year-old. By the spring of 1984, though, Mel was putting his life back together. He adjusted to the isolation of living alone, thanks in part to the companionship of his 3 beloved cats. Neighbors in the apartment building noted that Mel was fairly quiet and didn't interact much outside of waving hello. George Caverly, an upstairs neighbor who had lived above Mel for 12 years, noted that while he was quiet, he was far from antisocial. Caverly explained that he sometimes had Mel up for a drink, and even if it wasn't a social call, Mel was always there to help. Caverly explained, quote, "He's a quiet person around here, but we're friends. I'm handicapped, and sometimes I'd call down to him and ask if he'd bring up the newspaper or take out my trash. He's very helpful." End quote. Over the course of the next year, Mel stuck mostly to the routine he'd established in previous years. Waking in the morning, he'd leave his Medina apartment and make the short drive northeast to Hinckley. After arriving in the community, he'd proceed to K&K Donuts, located along Ridge Road, just across the street from the complex, which held both the Hinckley Police Department and Town Hall. Walking into the shop, Mel would take a seat at the counter or perhaps a table, and if time allowed, he'd order a medium coffee with cream, no sugar. Sitting at the counter, he'd chat with the co-owners, Mary and Carol, as well as many members of the town council. Inside the small bubble that was Hinckley Township, several former members of the council noted that K&K Donuts was the morning spot to catch up on gossip and discuss future plans. According to Mary, Mel was a fun-loving guy who was always good for a laugh. Sometimes he'd toy with new customers as they came into the shop, humorously warning them about the dangers of these donuts. Other times, if Mary and Carol were busy, Mel would answer the phone, but never the way that they needed. He'd pick up and say things like, "Mortuary, what can I do for you?" The shop had a large bulletin board on which locals could pin ads, offers, or requests, but for Mel, it was purely about humor. He'd post joke ads or little blurbs about ridiculous incidents happening in town, ones which never actually occurred. According to Mary, people were always looking forward to Mel's next post. After spending 30 or so minutes at the donut shop, he'd climb into his car, a 1980 tan Toyota Corolla station wagon his brother had left him in his will. It was a vehicle Mel treasured, as you might expect from a grieving older brother. From there, he'd cross the street, walk into the police department, and take a seat at his desk. While Mel was the chief of police, he didn't have a fancy office or his own area in the building, instead sharing an open office with other members of the department. He could frequently be found using his typewriter, filling out reports when necessary, writing for himself when he found the time. By this point in his life, Mel was taking writing even more seriously. A few years earlier, he'd taken some of his poetry and had it published through a private company. Entitled, "My Love is a Silver Shadow," not many people ever got to take a peek inside, but those who did noted that while Mel's work was good, it wasn't anything special. James Bigham would refer to it as just all right, and Mel's mother would tell him that he needed to use fewer cliches. While poetry may or may not have been Mel's strong suit, it's a subjective field and hard to judge from the opinions of others, he had also begun working on what was to be his first novel. Entitled Harvest of Madness, it followed the story of a detective working to solve a bizarre crime based partially on real events. On Wednesday, May 11th, 1966, 44-year-old William Hollenbaugh abducted 17-year-old Peggy Ann Bradnick from Shade Gap, Pennsylvania. Locals, police, and federal investigators flooded the area searching through multiple communities for the missing woman. According to Peggy's siblings, as they were making their way to school that morning, Hollenbaugh emerged from the woods and leveled his lever-action rifle at them, announcing that he didn't want any complaints. He was taking Peggy. When the children gave the description of the suspect to authorities, it was determined that he closely matched the description given of a sniper who over the previous 2 years had shot multiple residents of the area, as well as having indiscriminately fired into homes, cars, and businesses. The search for Peggy Ann and the hunt for her abductor would stretch out for a week, during which time there were several encounters between law enforcement and Hollenbaugh. Several witnesses reported seeing Hollenbaugh and Peggy Ann in the area of Burnt Cabins, Pennsylvania, and law enforcement officers worked together to try and surround the suspect. On Tuesday, May 17th, Hollenbaugh shot and killed an FBI agent. On Wednesday, the 18th, he shot and wounded Deputy Sheriff Francis Sharp, forcing him into the passenger seat of his own patrol unit. Hollenbaugh next moved Peggy into the car, having her lie down on the floor in the rear. He then proceeded over to Fort Littleton, where he pulled into the Rubeck family farm. Recognizing the suspect from descriptions in the papers, 15-year-old Larry Rubeck rushed into the family home, grabbed a 12-gauge shotgun, and hollered out for his mother to take cover. Moments later, as Hollenbaugh approached the house, Rubeck pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast penetrated through the home's front window, striking Hollenbaugh in the neck as he stepped up onto the porch. Finally, the nightmare was over for Peggy Ann Bradnick, and the sniper who had tormented the locals for 2 years would never be able to do so again. For one reason or another, Mel had an interest in this case and thought it would be a good backdrop for his book. He'd even gone far enough to visit Burnt Cabins to get the lay of the land and speak with locals who might remember the crime. In addition to his on-the-scene research, Mel also met up with Detective James Bigham, then working for the Medina Police Department. Bigham had recently completed a training program about new forensic techniques, and Mel inquired about them, wanting to ensure the details of his novel were up to date and accurate. By February of 1985, Mel had jumped back into the dating scene. He'd go out and have drinks with a few different women until he finally felt a connection with one, Judy Easter. This move allegedly ruffled some feathers as Judy was reportedly the ex-wife of another local law enforcement officer, according to the Akron Beacon-Journal. Allegedly, there were some within the department who felt Mel shouldn't have been dating the woman, or at least if he were going to, They thought a certain measure of discretion should have been employed. Regardless, Mel continued on with the relationship, and according to Judy, they were very happy together. Judy described Mel as very sweet and romantic, saying he was always writing her little notes, taking her on surprise trips, and presenting her with flowers whenever they went out. The two were spending a lot of time together, and Mel started talking about the future, trips they could take, places he wanted to show Judy, experiences he wanted them to have together. It seemed as though this was going to be more than just a flash in the pan. Maybe they could build something of real substance together. Judy was excited by all of the possibilities until one quiet weekend in late July when Mel vanished under bizarrely mysterious circumstances. Friday, July 26, 1985 was essentially a normal day for Mel Wiley. On schedule as usual, he walked into K&K Donuts at 7:30 a.m. and ordered his normal medium coffee. He exchanged a few pleasantries with Mary Kirby, but nothing out of the usual. By 8 a.m., he was spotted at his desk at the Hinckley Police Department across the street. As far as has been reported, there was nothing about this day that stood out to anyone, nor did anyone note anything odd or out of character about Mel himself. Ned Melvin, owner of a then Amoco gas station just south of the police department on Ridge Road, noted that Mel pulled into the station that evening after work. As usual, Mel was all smiles as he waved to Ned and joked that it was once again time for his every 2-week gas fill-up. Ned would later state that Mel seemed completely normal to him, and if anything, he was in better spirits than he usually was. After gassing up, Mel made the short drive home, heading southwest into Medina. Once at his apartment, he changed out of his uniform, took a shower, and went out for the night. His first stop was one of his usual haunts, the Gazebo Restaurant and Lounge, then located less than half a mile south from his apartment on North Court Street. According to employees and fellow patrons, Mel hung out at the lounge for an hour or so, ordering dinner and a few drinks. After wrapping up, he made the short drive over to Judy Easter's place, and the couple spent the night together. On Saturday, July 27th, Mel didn't really have any plans for the day. Much like Friday, Mel went to the Gazebo Restaurant and Lounge, where employees stated that he hung out for approximately an hour, his usual time, ordering his typical 2 drinks. After finishing up, Mel paid the tab and then made the short drive back to Judy Easter's place. The couple began discussing plans for an upcoming trip Mel was excited about. They were set on taking an Amtrak train out west to California, where Mel would show Judy all around his beloved Bay Area. While everything was moving along smoothly, this night would be a little out of the ordinary. Normally, Mel would spend the night with Judy, or she'd accompany him back to his place. This Saturday, though, Mel didn't stay over. Instead, he explained that he'd made plans for the next day, which would require him to get up early, so he was going to go back and sleep at his own place. According to Judy, Mel told her that an old friend was going to be in town Sunday, and he was going to meet up with this person at Cleveland's Edgewater Park, right on the shores of Lake Erie. Mel explained that him and this friend would be going swimming in the lake, and he needed to stop at Walmart in the morning so he could buy a bathing suit. The entire set of circumstances seemed a bit odd to Judy, who later noted that Mel wasn't a big fan of swimming. Not only did he not enjoy it, he also didn't like swimming because he disliked exposing the radiation burns on his arms and upper chest. He was shy about the way his body looked, and so the idea that he might be going swimming in Lake Erie didn't make sense on several levels. Despite this, Mel told Judy that he would call her the next day after he'd met up with this unnamed friend. Judy had no way of knowing that this would be the last time she would ever see Mel Wiley. Sunday, July 28th, came and went with no calls from Mel. In fact, no one who knew him heard from him on that day. His mother, Doris, would later tell investigators that she spoke to her son for the last time on Tuesday, July 24th, on the phone. She described the call as normal with nothing out of the ordinary. When the call concluded, Mel told his mother that he'd call her back on Sunday, but much like with Judy, that call never came. No one was concerned about Mel's whereabouts that day, and at the time, they had no reason to be. But when Monday, July 29th rolled around, some people began taking notice of the 47-year-old police chief's absence. Perhaps the first person to notice something was different that day were K&K Donut owners Mary Kirby and Carol Kozman. Mel didn't show up that morning, something he did every day before going into work. While this was out of the ordinary, it wasn't necessarily something that would cause them to be concerned or take pause. At the time, it was just something they noted as being out of the ordinary. As the morning carried on, several of Mel's fellow officers at the Hinckley Police Department noticed that their chief hadn't shown up. Whether or not anyone tried to contact Mel or went by his apartment to check on him has never been revealed. No one would report Mel missing that Monday, nor would anyone contact his family. At approximately 4 a.m. on the morning of Tuesday, July 30th, a park ranger patrolling Cleveland's Edgewater Park came upon an abandoned vehicle. Described as a tan 1980 Toyota Corolla station wagon, the vehicle was noted as being parked near a grassy knoll that led down to the beach. According to the park rangers, the vehicle was not spotted on Sunday night, which led them to believe that it had been left in that spot sometime after midnight on what would have become Monday morning. Now, here is where things get a little tricky. There are two very different, very distinct accounts of what happened after the car was found. According to one account, after running the license plate and finding that the vehicle belonged to Chief Wiley, David Stites, the park manager, contacted authorities to notify them that Tuesday. However, other accounts state that after finding the vehicle, park rangers made the decision not to disturb the car. Instead, they chose to keep the car under surveillance throughout the rest of the day, watching to see if Mel or anyone else approached. More than 24 hours later, on Wednesday, July 31st, investigators finally decided to enter the car and look it over for evidence. However, even the manner in which this was done seems subject to some debate. While park officials told the Dayton Daily News that they gained entry to the vehicle at 10 a.m. on Wednesday, a different story comes out of the Hinckley Police Department. According to police reports examined by the LA Times, it was not the park rangers who opened the car, but instead 46-year-old David Yates, a sergeant with the Hinckley Police who had worked under Mel for several years. Reportedly, upon arriving at the scene and finding the vehicle's doors locked, Sergeant Yates busted out a window and then reached inside. The inside of the vehicle was described as a very strange scene. Neatly folded and stacked on the passenger seat, they found a shirt, pants, socks, a belt, and shoes. A pack of Salem brand cigarettes was discovered tucked into one of the shoes. This was Mel's brand. All of the clothing was sitting on top of a beach towel next to which there was a bottle of suntan lotion. Pulling open the glove compartment, Sergeant Yates found Mel's wallet, which contained his credit cards, driver's license, police identification card, and his badge. There was also cash in the wallet totaling no more than $15, and a few coins were found in the pocket of the pants folded on the seat. A curious detail about the state of the vehicle actually came from an investigator who had known Chief Wiley well. Former Chief of Police Len Keller, who had appointed Mel as his second in command and whom Mel replaced in 1982, commented that he found the arrangement of the driver's seat to be odd. Mel was reported to have stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, but according to Keller, the driver's seat was pushed way forward, as though it was being driven by someone shorter than Chief Wiley. What makes this detail so interesting is that none of the investigators who directly worked on this case, including the lead investigator, have ever commented about the position of the seat. Just as a note, from this point forward, the story becomes somewhat difficult to pin down, as several people associated with the investigation will give different and sometimes contradictory statements about the investigation, the theories, and what evidence was actually recovered. According to investigators, there were no signs of a struggle nor of a crime found in the car or in the area around it. At this point in time, Sergeant Yates contacted his wife, Virginia, who worked as a dispatcher for the Hinckley Police. He asked Virginia to contact Medina Detective James Bigham so that Bigham could go to Mel's apartment. Virginia decided to go along, and the two of them arrived at the door of apartment 104B. After knocking several times and receiving no answer, they went around the building to where Mel had apparently left a window partially open. Both Virginia and Bigham entered the apartment through the window and found what they later described to be a very neat and organized apartment. There, the two investigators found both of Mel's guns, his .38 caliber Smith & Wesson service revolver, as well as his .38 caliber short barrel off-duty piece. There were several boxes of ammunition recovered as well. At the time, Mel had 3 cats, and Bigham and Yates found a large quantity of food and water portioned out for them, as though Mel, or someone, had known that no one was going to be in the apartment for several days, and they didn't want the cats to starve. Inside Mel's closet and dresser, the two investigators noticed that while the vast majority of clothes were still there, a large quantity of long-sleeve shirts were missing. Mel always wore long sleeves to hide the radiation burns on his arms. Also absent from the apartment were envelopes, stamps, typewriter paper, and Mel's address book. Bigham specifically began searching for both Mel's book of poetry as well as the manuscript to his novel, but neither of these items has ever been located. In the kitchen, they found the refrigerator had been almost entirely cleaned out. Only a half-eaten jar of mayonnaise remained. On a small kitchen table, they found a note which appeared to have been written in Mel's handwriting. It was just a short reminder he'd left for himself so that he wouldn't forget to pick up his laundry from the local dry cleaner. Hoping to perhaps find more clues, Bigham proceeded over to the shop where Mel always had his uniforms cleaned and pressed. While he went off to check the cleaners, Virginia stayed behind at the apartment before going back to the police department. At the dry cleaners, the owners provided Bigham with several of Mel's uniforms that were cleaned and waiting to be picked up. They also handed over a white envelope which contained several scraps of paper they pulled out of one of the uniform's pockets. Bigham examined the papers and, to his surprise, he found a schedule for the local yellow cab service, as well as a scrap of paper on which Mel had written something by hand. Closer examination would show that Mel had listed out the departure times of a Greyhound bus, which traveled out of Cleveland to Fort Ord, California, where Mel had previously been stationed. When Bigham mentioned this to Virginia after leaving the dry cleaners, she informed him that she'd found an Amtrak train schedule as well. Bigham then noted that Amtrak ran through a station near Edgewater Park. In fact, the platform was no more than 100 yards from where Chief Wiley's car had been found. To Bigham, the more evidence he found, the more he began getting the impression that maybe Mel's disappearance wasn't a crime. Perhaps the 47-year-old chief of police, with an artistic style and flair for the dramatic, had grown weary of solving mysteries and decided instead to create his own. Bigham was certainly not the only detective to get this impression, but there were plenty of people both working the case and in the local community who struggled to accept the possibility that Mel would have ever constructed his own disappearance. At this point, Bigham figured his best hope to try and locate Mel might lie with his then-girlfriend Judy Easter. Reaching out to her, Bigham learned the story that Mel had told her Saturday night, that he was going to go swimming with an old friend and he needed to buy a bathing suit at Walmart. Reportedly, Mel had added that the store was having a big sale on swimwear, so he should be able to pick up something cheap. But when Bigham went to the store, he learned that not only had there been no swimwear sale, there was no record of anyone purchasing a men's bathing suit that weekend. Bigham relayed the information to Sergeant Yates, who was still up at Edgewater Park. Considering the story about swimming, park officials and investigators began operating under the theory that Mel may have drowned in Lake Erie. Whether or not it was accidental or perhaps intentional, they weren't sure. A large-scale search of the park failed to turn up any clues. Park rangers tracked down and spoke with several people who had been to the park in the previous days, but none of them could recall seeing Mel or his car. At this point, investigators turned their attention towards the lake. Several searches were conducted in unison between the Cleveland Police Department, the Hinckley Police, Medina Police, and Medina County Sheriff's Office. While they knew the most direct path from Mel's car to the shoreline, they had no way of knowing if that specific spot would have been where he entered the water. Since they didn't have an exact location, investigators noted that they weren't sure that they could drag the lake. It would be a lot easier if they knew where to start, but that discussion in and of itself was mostly considered moot by that point. Park manager David Stites noted that had Mel gone into the water on Sunday or even as late as Monday, his body should have surfaced already. The currents might carry the body east or west along the shore, but Stites stated that the body would have likely surfaced within a mile or two from where the drowning had occurred. When asked if it were possible that Mel's body could have been tangled up at the bottom of the lake, Stites replied that the shoreline where Mel would have likely entered was almost entirely sand. There were no vines, rocks, or other objects in that area on which a body could get stuck. As water searches were being carried out, Sergeant Yates left Edgewater Park and made the 30-minute drive south, back to Hinckley. He arrived at Mel's desk and whipped open the top drawer, which was normally a mess, filled with papers, office supplies, and various items. On this day, though, there was nothing in the drawer except for a single key. A red tag hanging from the key was labeled 104B, Mel's apartment number. Yates later noted that he felt like Mel had left the key there to assist them, almost like he were saying, if you want to find me, you're going to need this to get into my apartment. Yates looked around and noticed that several of Mel's beloved model trains were still sitting on his shelves, but other items which were usually there appeared to be missing. Mel's reference books, which he'd used in writing his novel, as well as a box that had been filled with large manila folders, were gone. It was all rather strange, so when Sergeant Yates and Detective Bigham reconnected, Bigham decided to contact Mel's ex-wife. According to Cynthia, she hadn't heard from Mel in a little while, so she wasn't aware of what he might be doing. He did owe her an alimony payment, but the due date hadn't passed yet, and he hadn't missed any previous payments. At that point, Detective Bigham issued a statewide bulletin to all law enforcement agencies to be on the lookout for Chief Wiley. The next day, Thursday, August 1st, a massive search of Lake Erie was conducted by the Cleveland Police Department's Ports and Harbors Unit, the Coast Guard, and the Ohio Department of Natural Resources Division of Parks and Watercraft. Not a trace of Chief Wiley was found during the water searches, nor did they find anything which would have suggested that he'd ever even entered the water. This wasn't exactly surprising to many of the investigators who already found it difficult to believe that Mel would have ever gone swimming in the first place. The theory that perhaps Mel had crafted the mystery they were investigating began taking hold. The next step for investigators was to begin digging into Mel's life. At the time, they theorized that he might have shared his plans of leaving with someone else, or he may have hinted at where he planned to go. Asked about this possibility, Detective Bigham told the Beacon Journal that, considering his history in law enforcement and his time in military intelligence, Chief Wiley, quote, would be very capable of disappearing if that's what he wanted to do, end quote. The problem was, at least in terms of those who Mel had worked with, they seemed to know very little about his personal life. Sure, they knew of major events, the passing of his brother, his divorce from Cynthia, but for the most part, they didn't feel they really knew Mel himself. Both Sergeant Yates and Detective Bigham had worked with Mel for many years, but they'd both describe him as a quiet loner, not the type to come hang out after work or share drinks at the bar, preferring instead to go home to his apartment where he'd listen to his records and work on his writing. Finally, later that night, investigators reached out to Mel's family. While the chief hadn't been seen since Saturday the 27th and his car had been found on Tuesday the 30th, it wasn't until the late evening hours of the 1st that anyone spoke to his family. Mel's mother, Doris, expressed her frustration to local reporters, asking, quote, "Wouldn't you think the family would have been the first place they would have checked to see if maybe we knew where he was?" End quote. Strangely, when asked about this later, Detective Bigham noted that Doris's point was moot since when they did finally contact the family, they didn't know where he was anyway. Over the course of the next few days, investigators would speak with several of Mel's co-workers, friends, and family members, although each seemed just as surprised as the next to discover that Mel was missing. For the most part, people found it difficult to believe that Mel would have gone off without telling anyone, resigning his position, or at least keeping in touch with his family. His mother had just suffered through the loss of one of her sons 2 years earlier, and those who knew Mel didn't think he'd put her through the grief and the pain of losing another son. Suddenly, the discovery of new evidence would not only turn this case on its head, it would reveal a side of Mel Wiley that even his closest friends were unaware of. In their search for information that might lead them to finding what happened to Mel, Virginia Yates turned her attention to the typewriter on his desk. While there were no papers to go through, Virginia unspooled the ribbon and started working to transcribe what Mel had typed in the days leading up to his disappearance. It was a long and difficult process, as Mel had a habit of wanting everything he typed to be perfect, so he'd utilize the delete button frequently, causing letter strikeovers that were difficult to discern. Regardless, Virginia managed to transcribe an entire letter Mel had written, which hinted that he might be on his way out of town. Perhaps what was most intriguing was not the letter itself, but the person to whom it had been written. Over the years, both law enforcement and newspapers have respected the intended recipient's request that her name not be used, and I'll continue to honor that here. It was determined that the letter had been written to a local Medina woman, a married woman, with whom Mel had apparently carried on an affair. In the months leading up to his divorce, Mel had become taken with this woman, and she seemed to share his sentiments. In order to keep their correspondence on the down low, Mel purchased a P.O. box in downtown Medina and gave the key to this woman so he could send her letters without her husband becoming aware. While the full letter has never been released, certain excerpts were published in local papers over the years. The letter, which seems to give off the sense of being a goodbye, spoke of Mel's frustration with his day-to-day life and his need to move on. He wrote, in part, quote, "All that seems to exist for me here are the day-to-day reminders of all the things in the past 20 years that, once started, either did not work out or that never did have the potential for working out, no matter how much time would go by. By the time you read this, I'll be 2,400 miles away. By the time you receive this, I will, in a sense, have gone away. Fortunately or unfortunately, it's a one-way trip, so I'm told, with no possibility of ever returning." End quote. Detective Bigham, now assigned as the lead investigator on the case, described the letter as being the strongest evidence they had yet discovered. According to Bigham, it was beginning to look more and more like maybe Mel did stage his disappearance. Whether it had been done to drum up publicity for his upcoming book or for another reason entirely, no one was certain. Bigham later explained to the Cincinnati Enquirer, quote, "It's almost like he acted out the last chapter of a book and rode off into the sunset." End quote. Bigham went on to say that by this point in the investigation, they hadn't found any evidence to suggest that Mel was the victim of a crime, nor had they found anything to indicate he might have taken his own life. According to friends and family, Mel had been in good spirits, and no one was under the impression that he was depressed at all. Judy Easter would later note, quote, "If he was ever depressed, he sure hid it from me." End quote. When asked about the possibility, Sergeant Yates said that Mel was probably no more depressed than anyone else. He explained, quote, "This can be a crummy job. It's a pain. The guys on the road have to worry about themselves, and the sergeant worries about the guys on the road, and the chief worries about the sergeant and the guys on the road. Haven't you ever been tempted to change your job?" End quote. Bigham noted that while the prevailing theory would suggest Mel concocted the disappearance for one reason or another, they hadn't ruled out other possibilities, including homicide, abduction, or suicide. When a reporter brought up the abandoned car and all of the items found inside of it, Bigham replied, quote, "Everything that would lead someone to believe he went swimming. The only problem is Mel was not a swimmer. You have to work on the assumption he took himself out of the picture. He was divorced with no children. There was no real reason to keep him here. He had the background and ability to get lost if he wanted to." End quote. In order to try and determine if perhaps Mel did plan his disappearance, investigators began digging into his bank and telephone records. Ultimately, they determined that Mel hadn't made any large withdrawals, he had not discussed travel plans with anyone, and they couldn't find any record of anything suggesting he'd even made travel plans. Turning back towards the married woman Mel had been writing letters to, investigators learned several interesting details. Apparently, while Mel had deep feelings for this woman and often wrote to her about his love for her, his vision of their future, and his desire to marry her, the woman wasn't exactly interested. While the relationship had carried on for over a year, according to the woman, it had all come to an end in February, 5 months before Mel vanished and just before he started dating Judy Easter. On several occasions, Mel had tried to convince this woman to leave her husband and be with him, but she refused to do so. At the time, her husband was ill, and she told investigators that she'd made it clear to Mel that even if she were single, she had no intentions of marrying him. Apparently, Mel wrote to her in February and explained that if she wasn't going to be leaving her husband, then their relationship was over. While this affair was presented as though it was this big secret, it seems that that wasn't actually the case. Some folks may have elected to look the other way or pretend that they didn't know about it, but we know for a fact it wasn't a big secret. According to police reports accessed by the LA Times, a patrolman working under Chief Wiley at the time had confronted him about this affair. Allegedly, Officer Steve Hinckley wrote an unsigned letter to Mel threatening that he would report the affair to local papers and to the town trustees if he didn't put a stop to it. The Times goes on to note that Hinckley was never questioned in Mel's disappearance and would go on to later become a sergeant with the Hinckley Police. When reached by the LA Times, he declined comment. In the days following Mel's disappearance, everyone who spoke to investigators or reporters had nothing but great things to say. L. John Rybar, then Medina County Sheriff, described Wiley saying, quote, "He was open-minded and worked well with everyone. He was a real decent type of individual. He was mild-mannered and quiet, but he was a thinker and a doer." End quote. Hildred Sewell, then president of the Chamber of Commerce, lauded Mel for his hard work and dependability, telling the Beacon Journal, quote, "He's a very gentle person, a very, very, very nice person who helped the chamber. I could walk in his office and say, 'Mel, I need you,' and he would say, 'Where and when?'" End quote. Mel's former boss, Len Keller, noted that the chief was a bright guy who could be trusted to handle the complexities of the office, saying, quote, "Mel was a technician. If you let him go off on a project, he was great, but he did not like politics." End quote. Officers who worked under Mel during his years as chief were extremely complimentary. Those who had worked with him previously, such as Detective Bigham, spoke highly of Mel's work both during their time together at the sheriff's office as well as his time as chief. Ron Rhodes, a former trustee, would tell reporters that the one thing he knew about Mel above everything else was, quote, "He was 100% police officer." End quote. However, these opinions begin shifting the longer the investigation goes on. Slowly, it appears to the outsider that those investigating Mel's disappearance were becoming his biggest critics. This may have had something to do with a bizarre story that would come out about Chief Wiley and some of the things he'd been writing about. Approximately a year before Mel's disappearance in the summer of 1984, Hinckley dispatcher Virginia Yates became curious and later suspicious about what Chief Wiley was doing at work all day. According to both of the Yateses, Mel's behavior and actions in that last year had made them wonder if something strange was going on. According to an article in the Plain Dealer, Virginia noted that every time she walked past Mel's desk, he seemed to go out of his way to cover up what he was typing. In response to this, the dispatcher began going through Chief Wiley's trash, reading through all of his drafts and in some cases, completed letters and reports that he had typed. According to Virginia Yates, over the course of the next year, she retrieved nearly 200 pages, which included long, introspective letters written to the married Medina woman, pornographic stories, and lewd drawings. Some of the writings supposedly were sexual stories that involved women at a local church Mel had attended with his ex-wife. According to later reports, the discovery of these stories was the final straw which led Cynthia to file for divorce. In addition to the letters, Virginia also found an order form signed by Mel for $28 worth of pornographic stories from Library Service Incorporated, a San Diego-based publishing house. Despite these discoveries, neither David nor Virginia Yates ever included any of this information in the reports they filed surrounding Mel's disappearance. Asked about this, they later stated that they didn't want to include the information about the pornographic writings because they didn't think it would be appropriate to release to the public. Strangely, neither seemed to have reservations when it came to discussing all of these details with the Los Angeles Times. According to Virginia, she believed this information should have been handed over to trustees who would have likely removed Mel from his position as chief. Had that information been handed over, as well as the reports of Mel's relationship with the married woman, maybe that would have happened. However, the trustees were never told, nor were any official reports submitted discussing the writings pilfered from Mel's wastebasket. In what I can only call a first for me, we actually get to see the disagreement between two investigators, Virginia and David Yates, as it plays out in the media. Asked why she hadn't gone straight to the trustees herself, Virginia replied, quote, "I went through the chain of command. I went to the sergeant. I felt something was wrong. It's not normal." End quote. As fate would have it, her husband, David Yates, was that sergeant. When the Times asked him why he hadn't taken the information from Virginia and presented it to the trustees or at least confronted Mel about it, Yates kind of shrugged as he replied, quote, "What for? I did my job and he did his. I just did my job." End quote. According to Sergeant Yates, he even reached out to another officer at a different department and asked what he should do with the lewd drawings. "What should you do with them?" the officer responded. "Nothing." Asked her thoughts about Mel and the situation as a whole, Virginia didn't mince words. She made it remarkably clear that not only did she think little of Mel, she thought even less of his work as a chief of police. Virginia explained, quote, "He spent half a day typing, then he went home. Basically, I liked Mel. He was a mellow man, and I thought something was going on with him. Did I feel aggravated? Yeah, because there were a lot of problems that needed to be handled, and they weren't being handled, so it caused a lot of trouble for me. I think Mel was appointed to a job that he couldn't handle, and it got too much for him." End quote. This is a very strange statement to make, especially since almost everyone else had only positive things to say about Mel. You're talking about a man who worked for the FBI straight out of high school, attended 2 prominent universities, worked in counterintelligence for the Army for 3 years, during which time he had access to the Nevada Atomic Test Site. A man who completely reorganized the Medina Sheriff's Department's approach to fingerprint recovery and analysis, who had personally instructed the Ohio State Police on similar methods, and who had been working in law enforcement for nearly 20 years. To many, it seemed a bit odd to refer to this same man as being unable to handle a job as slow and uneventful as being chief of police in Hinckley. Former trustee chairman Robert Hale was surprised by the news, telling the Beacon Journal that they'd always thought highly of Mel, saying, quote, "We were satisfied with him totally. I never heard anyone say anything bad about him in any way." End quote. Strangely, Sergeant Yates would later state that Mel had discipline problems and frequently had been reprimanded for showing up late to work. Robert Hale denied that, saying that he wasn't aware of any time Chief Wiley had been disciplined. According to him, the trustees tended to give Mel more slack in regard to his schedule because he was on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Detective Bigham would later confirm the existence of the lewd writings and noted that he had contact information for all of the women that Wiley wrote about, but he didn't think it was necessary to interview them. They had no awareness of the stories Mel was writing, and ultimately, it seems, no one would have known about any of these stories had Virginia Yates not been going through Mel's trash. This led some to wonder, why was the writing offensive if it was clear that Mel had no intentions of sharing it, went out of his way to hide his typewriter so no one else could see it, and thought perhaps that the stories he threw out would be safe in his garbage, never expecting one of his employees to be going through it. While this was new information and cast Mel in a different kind of light, revealing details about his life that even his closest confidants were unaware of, it really didn't do anything in terms of advancing the investigation. Sure, Chief Wiley may have enjoyed writing pornographic stories, but he never showed them to anyone, he didn't advertise his actions, and he worked to keep it secret. In what way could that relate to his disappearance? Well, in the minds of investigators, it didn't play a role at all. Detective Bigham once again met with the married woman that Mel had been writing to. In regard to that last letter, the one transcribed from the typewriter ribbon, the woman claimed she'd never received it. At the time, no one knew if Mel had actually mailed the letter or maybe had decided against it. One interesting detail, however, involved the closing of that P.O. box. According to the plane dealer, while the public was not aware of Mel's disappearance until his car was opened on Wednesday, July 31st, the unnamed woman closed the P.O. box one day earlier, on Tuesday, July 30th. Asked about this, Bigham commented that he didn't believe it suggested the woman had any advanced knowledge of Mel's disappearance. Bigham noted that the woman knew many law enforcement officers in the area and likely learned about the disappearance from one of them. At the same time, some have wondered why the P.O. box was not closed in February, when the relationship allegedly ended, instead of being closed the day before it went public that Mel was missing. It has also been noted that despite Mel not showing up for work on Monday or Tuesday, no one he worked with had inquired about his whereabouts or his health. On Wednesday, August 14th, more than 2 weeks after Mel had last been seen, Detective Bighams called a press conference where investigators would discuss the status of the case. During the conference, Bigham announced that they were now operating from the belief that Mel staged his own disappearance. He explained, quote, "We now feel we can prove that Mel is alive." The typewriter ribbon tells quite a bit of the story of Mel's last thoughts and feelings while he was sitting in that chair. He was tired of getting nowhere. He outlined personal and professional problems that were building. It was a general frustration, a feeling of getting nowhere fast. He felt he was not accomplishing anything. Throughout the investigation, we felt that Mel was alive, and so far, we are convinced that we have a successful conclusion. We're sure he wasn't murdered or drowned, and that he just decided to walk away from it all. End quote. Bigham went on to explain that, in his final letter, Mel had made it clear that not only was he leaving Medina County, he probably was never coming back. Another excerpt from that final letter reads, quote, "Where I have gone is of no critical importance, and it's very doubtful that I will ever return. And if by some chance I ever should be in the area again, it will be years from now, and only in the act of just passing through. Take care wherever you go or whatever you do. Try not to judge me too harshly. I'm not trying to hurt anyone." End quote. Bigham stated that they had found nothing to indicate Mel had sought out counseling or professional help prior to his disappearance. The letter, reviled as the key piece of evidence in the case, was described by Bigham as, quote, "lengthy and typical of Mel, with lots of revisions and lots of publishing." According to investigators, they hadn't found any evidence to suggest Mel's disappearance was in any way an attempt to gain publicity for the book he was writing, a book which they still didn't know if he had ever finished. When Mel's ex-wife was asked, she told investigators that when she'd left, Mel had written about 5 chapters, and she had no idea if he'd ever finished. Bigham discussed several other pieces of information which had led them to believe that Mel had run off on his own. One of these revolved around money. While they had found no records to show Mel had withdrawn any large sums of money from his bank account, they did find evidence that he may have been putting money aside. He had previously borrowed money from the woman he'd had the affair with, approximately $2,000, and he hadn't been paying his bills. According to his mother, when she cleaned out her son's apartment, she learned that he hadn't paid his bills for June or July. As it turned out, his last 2 paychecks, which arrived after his disappearance, were just enough to cover everything. It was believed Mel had skipped the bills and instead pocketed the cash to give himself some travel money, knowing later checks would cover them. In addition to this, both Sergeant Yates and Virginia Yates stated that they noticed items slowly disappearing from Mel's desk in the weeks before his disappearance. Sergeant Yates pointed out that a collection of books Mel kept had been growing smaller and smaller each week. Believing now that Mel staged the disappearance and ran off to start a new life, Detective Bigham noted 3 separate places where they were looking for the missing chief. Their primary target was the Chinatown area of San Francisco. Aside from the fact that Mel had made his love of San Francisco known to just about anyone who cared to listen, both his ex-wife and the unnamed married woman claimed that Mel had mentioned a dream of moving to California, where he felt the environment and creative people around him would be good for his burgeoning career as an author. After San Francisco, investigators were also targeting Burnt Cabins, Pennsylvania, the town in which Mel's book was set, as well as Florida, where Mel had several friends who had previously retired from law enforcement. Detective Bigham stated, quote, "We'd like to try to help Mel, but we have to find him to do that. We are reasonably sure that he walked away of his own accord and on his own volition." End quote. Bigham went on to explain that at the time, there were no plans to file criminal charges against Mel since he has every right to disappear should he choose to. However, Bigham did put Mel into the system as a missing person, so should he be stopped, identified, or fingerprinted, it would come up that he's missing. At that point, while the investigation into Mel's disappearance wasn't technically closed, in the minds of most investigators, there wasn't much left to say. Bigham and others continued to believe that Mel had orchestrated this complex mystery in order to leave town with a little fire, maybe leaving people with a story to discuss, or perhaps to see if this ending might make an appropriate ending for his book. While investigators may have believed that they knew the story, many people who knew Mel, including friends, family, and coworkers, simply didn't buy it. Mary Kirby, for instance, was highly outspoken with her view that the story, as told by investigators, didn't make sense. She explained to the Beacon Journal, saying, quote, "The fact that his car was where it was and that he cared so much about that car. Would you leave your precious train collection? Would you leave your mom, who already lost a son? Would you leave her when you cared? You have a pension fund that has, I don't know how much in it. Would you leave that behind? Would you not have done things just a little more to secure yourself? I mean, would you just walk off and leave whatever you possessed behind? Did he want to disappear so badly that he threw it all away? Credit cards, your driver's license, your car? Would you have left everything and just walked off and not even cared about something? I don't know. I really don't know. I just get a bad feeling." End quote. In early October, a little more than 2 months after Mel went missing, the Board of Trustees finally decided they couldn't wait any longer. They declared his position open and in the meantime appointed Sergeant Yates as interim chief of police. 3 months later, on Friday, January 10th, 1986, after going over the resumes of more than 20 applicants, the Board of Trustees officially installed David Yates as the new full-time chief of police. Trustees noted that they had hoped Mel would return, but in his extended absence, life must go on. Curiously, just 10 days after Yates became the interim chief, on Monday, October 21st, the Medina Gazette received an unsigned postcard. Postmarked out of Canada, the message was only 1 line long and read, quote, "Your editorial, Wiley's Mystery, was elementary. Try to improve." End quote. While most people attributed the message to a random critique, investigators, including James Bigham, believed there was a good chance that postcard had been written and mailed by Mel Wiley. Whether or not this was the case has never been proven. The year of 1986 would pass with little mention of Mel, his disappearance, or the possibilities. July of 1987 would bring about the 2-year mark since he had last been seen. For the first time since the entire mystery had begun, Mel's family began speaking out in the public, both in support of Mel and in critique of the investigation. Mel's sister, Karen Karp, summed up the family's feelings quite eloquently, telling the Plain Dealer, quote, "It wasn't much of an investigation. It was more like a cover-up." End quote. For the family, there were simply too many questions for which investigators had no answers, or in their minds, the answers made little sense. Doris pointed out that her son was less than 3 years away from retirement, where he would have obtained his full pension. She also noted that while the claim is that Mel ran off to start a new life, she wondered why he left behind approximately $16,000 in savings and retirement benefits. Just for the record, adjusted for inflation, $16,000 in 1985 is the equivalent of $44,000 today. Another item people found it hard to believe Mel would abandon was his car, the one his brother had left him. According to everyone who knew him, that car meant the world to Mel, and he treated it like it was his baby. Mary Kirby later stated, quote, "He absolutely treasured that car. One day, someone almost backed into it, and he almost fainted. That's the most emotion I've ever seen him show. End quote. Karen felt strongly that investigators were hiding something, though she didn't know what exactly. She noted, quote, I think the police know more than they're telling us. I think they're covering something up. End quote. One example of a detail the family found bizarre was the broken window on Mel's car. As I mentioned earlier, there are two stories about this. Either the park rangers gained access to the vehicle first, or Sergeant Yates broke the window himself. Weirdly, when asked about the broken window, lead investigator James Bigham said he couldn't remember anything about a window being broken. There were several questions lingering about the investigation in terms of how far detectives had gone to find answers. Many friends and family members felt the investigation was botched from the beginning, with notable people either being questioned weeks after Mel disappeared or never at all. Mary Kirby noted that she had known Mel for years and spoke with him on an almost daily basis, yet 2 years later, she'd never been interviewed by police. Similarly to how Bigham explained his decision not to contact the family once Mel had been determined to be missing, in this instance he stated that he didn't interview Mary Kirby because he'd already interviewed so many other people about Mel. Wilda Sewell, Medina Council president, agreed that this was an oversight, asking, quote, it seems you'd want to talk to the last persons who saw him and ask, how did he seem to you? End quote. Then there were those who were a little more blunt in their criticism of the investigators and, to some degree, what motivations might be behind their actions. Josephine Becks, a town trustee at the time, wasn't sure about the idea of Mel leaving and even questioned the veracity of the letter pulled from his typewriter ribbon, saying, quote, it's not in his character to just disappear, and too many people have access to his typewriter. End quote. Becks was not alone in this belief, as several other trustees and members of the community theorized the ribbon could have been staged, either by Mel to confuse the investigation or perhaps by someone who wanted to make him look bad in the aftermath. Previously, investigators had stated their beliefs that Mel could be in Florida, California, or Pennsylvania. In the police files, there's a teletype message which Detective Bigham sent to the San Francisco police, notifying them of Mel's disappearance and the possibility that he might be using the false identity of Todd Allen Moran, the name of his main character in the novel he was writing. Part of the reason for this belief was that one letter found on the typewriter ribbon was signed Todd Allen Moran, date of birth February 26, 1940, Social Security number 296523480. However, while Bigham claimed that he also sent bulletins to the police in Burnt Cabins, Pennsylvania, that department told the plane dealer that they were never contacted in regard to Mel Wiley. Then there was the blackmail theory. Where exactly this originated seems unclear, but several people in the family and close to Mel began wondering if perhaps he'd left town not by his own choice, but under the threat of exposure. Perhaps the affair with the married woman, maybe about his erotica, maybe about something which has never come to the surface. His mother Doris explained, quote, I believe he had adequate cause to leave. There was something that threatened his life. I'm just not sure whether he made it or not. That's all. End quote. For his part, Detective Bigham wasn't much of a believer in the blackmail theory. Asked about it, he replied, quote, I don't think he was blackmailed. I think he pretty much got fed up with where his life was at. He was as high in rank as he could go, and it wasn't satisfying to him. End quote. At the same time, part of Mel's final letter does allude to the fact that maybe circumstances forced his hand, and that leaving was not entirely his own decision. That passage reads, quote, already, I should be well on my way to having become history to her. And because of the particular circumstances behind that event, there will be no way that I can ever communicate with her in any manner ever again. End quote. What the particular circumstances were that he wrote of, no one has been able to determine. Everyone associated with the investigation in an official capacity was telling the family that they believed Mel was alive, and if he wanted to contact them, he would. James Bigham chalked up much of the investigation to what evidence they had to support and what they simply could find no evidence for. He explained, quote, We investigated it like a homicide, but homicide doesn't add up. Suicide doesn't add up. Gangland slaying doesn't add up. Kidnap doesn't add up. No, it all just doesn't add up. None of it does." End quote. Meanwhile, Doris was living the nightmare of believing that something horrible had happened to her son. After cleaning out his apartment, she took many of his belongings into her own home. Some of his train cars sat on shelves, and his pet cats were now under her care. All she wanted to know was what happened to her son and whether or not he was alive. Her home, located just a few hundred feet from a railroad crossing, was a constant reminder of Mel. She explained, quote, "I hear the whistle of a train, and I think, I wonder if he can hear it, if he's even alive. I think it, and I feel sad." End quote. In hopes of finding answers, Mel's other sister, Myra, hired a high-profile Kansas City private investigator to dig into her brother's case. While the man did travel to Ohio and spent several weeks working the investigation, he never came up with anything more than the primary investigators had uncovered. Myra believed it was possible her brother was being blackmailed, but she thought it was equally worthy of consideration that something he may have stumbled upon during the course of his job caused him to flee under the threat of violence. At the same time, while she didn't want to believe it, she had to acknowledge the possibility that her brother was dead. Doris felt the best thing that could be done was to tell everything that was known, expose every detail of the case, both those that made Mel look good and those that made him look bad. She explained, quote, "I suspect Myra thinks he's dead. All my friends think he's dead. Karen thought he was dead. I don't know. If the theory of blackmail is correct, then this should remove that threat. I don't care what disgrace this brings on. It's better. Sunshine reaches a lot of dark corners." End quote. Unfortunately, the case remained stagnant, and for their part, investigators with both the Medina City Police and the Hinckley Police closed the case, stating their belief that Mel was alive and had left of his own accord. 6 years later, in November of 1993, Doris Wiley officially asked the court to have her son declared legally dead. It wasn't a decision that was arrived at lightly, but as Doris explained, it was purely about tying up loose ends with the estate. Doris testified that she hadn't seen her son since June 7th, 1985, and that she hadn't spoken with him on the phone since July 24th of that same year. Doris said that Mel had always kept in touch with her and was very attached to his cats, who she had a hard time believing he would leave behind. According to paperwork filed by Doris's lawyer, Jonathan Steinglass, Mel did not leave a will. Approximately $3,500 was in one of Wiley's accounts, and an unknown amount needed to be determined from the state public employees' retirement fund. Steinglass argued that all of the assets and funds should be awarded to Doris. However, there were complications with this argument. Firstly, Mel had apparently signed an agreement with the married woman in which he named her as the sole beneficiary to his life insurance. Then there was Mel's ex, Cynthia, who by this point in time was owed back alimony payments plus interest. On Tuesday, November 16th, 1993, Judge L. Thomas Skidmore officially pronounced Mel Wiley presumed dead. Judge Skidmore noted, quote, "Notice, I didn't say he was dead. The court isn't all-knowing. It's a legal presumption for estate purposes." End quote. This is essentially where the investigation into the disappearance of Mel Wiley ended. For years afterward, there would be talk about the missing man, the only police chief to that time to have ever been listed as a missing person by the FBI. Some continued to believe Mel had constructed the story, set the scene, and written his own ending, fading back into a false identity and carrying on a new life. Others, however, believe the 47-year-old was the victim of a complex crime which was either covered up or was missed entirely as a result of negligence. On Friday, February 3rd, 1989, Mel's sister, Karen Karp, passed away at the age of 41. There were no letters, no flowers, no calls, or any contact from her brother. On Wednesday, June 14th, 1995, Doris Wiley passed away at the age of 75. She spent the last 10 years of her life trying to find the truth of what had become of her son, and according to Doris directly, she had never heard from her beloved son ever again. Today, the only member of Mel's immediate family who still remains is his sister Myra, who is 79 years old. All those years later, Josephine Becks remains convinced that Mel was the victim of some kind of foul play and often finds herself wondering if he might be buried close to home, somewhere near Hinckley. One of the reasons for this continued belief was Doris's passing. As Beck explained, quote, "He was so close to his mother that if he had left, he would have come back for her funeral." End quote. On Wednesday, September 28th, 2006, James Robert Bigham passed away at the age of 70 following a battle with cancer. Recognized throughout the community for his years of dedication to law enforcement and later the Cleveland Clinic, his passing was met with respectful sadness. Throughout the rest of his life, Bigham never forgot about Mel and often wondered what truly happened that weekend in July. With his last public thoughts on the case, Bigham acknowledged that even though he believed the chief had left of his own volition, he will continue to think about not only the missing chief, but the friend and co-worker he knew for so many years. Bigham explained, quote, "What starts to tie you down in life certainly would be family, loved ones, someone you care about, and a job. If you lose feelings for that job, and if you lose your feelings for those people or want more, finally you say, enough's enough, you know? I think Mel wrote his book on the way out. I think he gave his ending here. He said, 'Here's my boots in the sunset. Now leave me the hell alone. I want to start a new life.' I think about him more than most people would think. I've handled a lot of cases, but Mel's case just, it gets to you because it's someone you know." End quote. When last seen, Melvin Lee Wiley was described as a white male with receding brown hair and hazel eyes, standing 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighing approximately 165 pounds. He has radiation burn scarring on his arms and part of his chest, and at the time of his disappearance, he had a wart on the end of his nose. Mel's car, a tan 1980 Toyota Corolla station wagon, was found abandoned at Edgewater Park near the shores of Lake Erie. The last confirmed sighting of Mel occurred on the evening of Saturday, July 27th, 1985 in Medina, Ohio. According to his then-girlfriend, he planned to go swimming with a friend at Edgewater Park. Investigators do not believe Mel ever intended to go swimming, nor could they track down anyone he may have been planning to meet that day. This July will mark 38 years that Chief Wiley has been missing. At the time of his disappearance, Mel was 47 years old, and if alive today, he would be turning 85 in May. Did the chief of police fall victim to a crime? Was he lured into a trap, perhaps perpetrated by people he believed he could trust? Or did Mel Wiley truly write his own ending, leaving behind a mystery which continued to endure more than 35 years later? For many, they believe the latter, and accept the possibility that Melvin Wiley may still be alive out there somewhere, or just maybe, he's one of the countless John Does awaiting identification. Perhaps it's best to conclude with Mel's own words, ones written during happier days, with dreams of the California sun and the electric buzz of San Francisco. Quote, "The twin steel ribbons of Track 2 came to life, filling the nearby air with the song of steel upon steel. Each time I've gone to San Francisco, I've always spent a good deal of time in Chinatown, taking in all the sights, sounds, and smells, and every time I've always had the sensation of being home." The disappearance of Chief Mel Wiley is unlike almost any case I've covered. While in most cases the theory that someone is elected to go off of their own volition is endlessly mocked and often becomes a source of frustration, this is an instance in which it's not only possible, it seems like the most likely scenario. Chief Wiley, frustrated with the direction of his job, his life, and his relationships, decided that it was time to move on. Rather than resigning from his position, notifying friends and family, and moving away as is normally done, it's believed that he instead constructs this complicated mystery in an attempt to, well, that's kind of part of the problem. Nobody really knows. It's been suggested that maybe he did it to drum up publicity for his novel, but investigators later rule that out. And since, as far as can be ascertained, his novel was never published, this would have been an odd motivator. Others believe that the reason Mel did things this way was because of his own personal flair for the dramatic. Rather than shaking hands and moving on with little pomp and circumstance, he elects to disappear in a way which ensures everyone will notice. That's certainly a possibility. Still yet, there are some who believe that Mel's reason for leaving in such a bizarre manner was simply because Mel himself was a bit strange. Maybe he thought it would be interesting, or perhaps he hoped that his sudden disappearance might cause that married woman he was in love with to rethink her position. The truth of the matter is, no one knows for certain why Mel would have left in such an odd way, and to expand beyond that a bit more, no one knows for certain that Mel actually did leave. Since this case is so very wide open in terms of theories, there's little evidence or information to support anything beyond Mel running off, it becomes difficult to really analyze the circumstances. So rather than going through the minutiae of every possible outcome, we'll instead focus on the evidence as presented to us by investigators and see if, in the end, it makes the most sense to accept the results of their investigation, or if the possibility exists that Mel's disappearance was not of his own choosing, or perhaps was of his own choosing, but for a different reason. Frankly, if we tried to touch on everything about this case that stands out as strange, this episode would never end. According to the official story, Mel tells his girlfriend, Judy Easter, on the night of Saturday, July 27th, that the next day he's meeting up with an unnamed friend to go swimming in Lake Erie at Cleveland's Edgewater Park. According to Easter, he notes that he has to stop at Walmart to buy a bathing suit and that he'll call her later in the day. This is a case fraught with disagreements, contradictions, and conflicting theories, and yet one detail everyone agrees on is the fact that Mel Wiley did not go swimming, did not like swimming, and certainly never would have gone swimming in Lake Erie. So pretty much from the get-go, nobody buys this story. Nobody hears from or sees Mel on Sunday the 28th, Monday the 29th, or Tuesday the 30th. He doesn't show up for work, doesn't call in sick, doesn't notify anyone. Yet, no one he works with tries to reach him either day. They don't call his house, contact his landlord, or conduct a welfare check. It seems, for reasons unknown, nobody thought anything needed to be done about it. It all changes when they receive word from park rangers that Mel's abandoned car has been found at Edgewater Park. Depending on which story you believe, the park rangers either decide of their own volition to surveil the car for a day, or they were asked to do this. Either way, it's the only missing persons case I've ever covered in which, when the car was found, they surveil it for a day before going into it. At 10 a.m. on Wednesday the 31st, the car's finally opened. Police reports obtained by the LA Times will later explain that upon being notified, Sergeant Yates went to the park and, finding Mel's car locked, smashed in the window. Inside, they found clothes, money, Mel's wallet, license, police ID, and badge, among other items. Given the story told to Judy Easter and the situation with the car, investigators theorized that Mel went into the lake and perhaps drowned, or he's gone above and beyond to set the scene to make it look that way. As Detective Bigham later commented, everything that would point to Mel going swimming was in that car, other than the fact that everyone who knew Mel knew he wouldn't have gone swimming. They checked the park, searched the lake several times, but ultimately find nothing to suggest Mel had ever been there. For whatever reason, former Medina City Chief of Police Homer Davis points out that the driver's seat of Mel's car was pushed way forward, as if someone shorter had been driving, which was odd since Mel was known to be 5 feet 10 inches tall. This is a piece of information about the case which is never expounded on, explained, or even mentioned by the official investigators. The same goes for the broken window, as Detective Bigham later claims he doesn't remember anything about there being a broken window on the car. Unsure of what to do, Detective Bigham is sent to Mel's apartment along with Hinckley dispatcher Virginia Yates, the wife of Sergeant Yates. After entering through a partially open window, they don't find anything that suggests a crime occurred there. What they do find are signs that Mel, or someone else, knew no one was going to be in the apartment for several days. The food was cleaned out of the fridge, and there was water and food portioned out for the cats. While they note that Mel's envelope, stamps, and typewriter paper are missing, their attention is drawn to the closet. Most of Mel's clothes are there, but a large quantity of his long-sleeved shirts are missing, and due to the radiation burns, Mel only wore long-sleeved shirts. In addition to this, when Detective Bigham goes out of his way specifically searching for either Mel's book of poetry or the manuscript to Harvest of Madness, he can't find them. In fact, all these years later, neither of those books have ever been found. Driven forward by a message Mel left on his kitchen table, Bigham heads to the dry cleaners where he discovers that Mel had papers in his pocket. There's the schedule for the Yellow Cab Company and a handwritten note which lists departure times of a Greyhound bus which travels out of Cleveland to Fort Ord, California, a place where Mel has some history. Virginia tells Bigham she also found an Amtrak schedule, and Bigham remembers that there's an Amtrak platform no more than 100 yards from where Mel's car was found. The picture begins coming in clearly. Perhaps Mel did all of this to add confusion or create a distraction so that no one would notice that he packed a bag, walked away from his car, boarded a train, and headed west to his beloved California. Almost from the outset of the mystery, it becomes clear that investigators don't believe a crime ever occurred, and they're not worried about Mel's safety, but they are deeply confident that he ran off. The clincher when it comes to this case is the letter pulled out of the typewriter ribbon on Mel's desk. Virginia Yates unspools the ribbon and works to reconstruct everything Mel had typed on it in the days leading up to his disappearance. From that comes a few different letters, but the one allegedly written to the married woman Mel was having an affair with grabs all of the attention. In it, Mel apparently writes about his frustration with his job, with his life, with his writing career. He feels stuck, unappreciated, unnoticed, and thinks maybe it's time to move on. While the letter reads like someone saying goodbye, there are also pieces of it which don't make sense. Who is the woman he mentions that he can never contact again? What are the circumstances he addresses that have put him in a position where he has to leave? Strangely, it seems, anything pulled from the typewriter ribbon that supports the idea that Mel ran off is lauded as legitimate. Anything which contradicts that, raises questions, or discusses mysterious circumstances is dismissed or never addressed. After speaking to the woman, Bigham is told that she never received this letter, perhaps because she closed the P.O. box on July 30th, before Mel had even been officially listed as missing. No one really knows what happened there, and judging from the information that has been released, it doesn't look like they tried too hard to find out. Here is where we run into what I consider a big problem in this case. According to statements made by both Virginia and David Yates, for approximately a year before Mel's disappearance, they were suspicious that something was going on with him. Virginia said her suspicions were only strengthened when she noticed that anytime she walked through the office, Mel covered up his typewriter as though he didn't want her to see what he was writing. So, how does she respond? For a year, she digs through his trash and collects more than 200 pieces of writing, which include letters to friends, official reports, letters to the married woman, and a series of pornographic stories. While she wants to use these stories and writings to get Mel removed from his position, David isn't interested. He doesn't see why he should report the writings. They don't have anything to do with Mel's job, and he wasn't trying to share them with anyone. In fact, he went out of his way to try and make sure no one saw them. Either way, Virginia believes this is a sign that something is wrong with Mel. She considers it highly unprofessional and unethical and wants something done. At the same time, she includes nothing about this in any of the reports she files following Mel's disappearance. Asked about it later, she said she didn't want to include the information in reports that the public might see. Of course, she's explaining all of this to the LA Times. So she didn't want to put it in official reports because the public shouldn't see it, but then she's fine talking about it openly in a major newspaper. This has never made any sense to me. Having spoken to a few current members of law enforcement about this, they all gave me similar replies. Essentially, it was theorized that the reason none of that writing was in official reports is because Virginia would have had to have included where she had gotten the writing from, and it doesn't look good on any police officer's report, especially one who wants to make detective, that you spent your free time digging through your boss's trash. Now, you can have whatever perspective you want about the lewd stories Mel was apparently writing. Personally, I don't care. It would be one thing if he was trying to force people to read it, or if he was putting it up on the wall where everybody could see it, but he kept it to himself and tried to keep it safe. I kind of stand with Sergeant Yates on this one. What's the point of reporting it? He was getting his job done, wasn't bothering anyone, and unless someone went out of their way to dig through his garbage, no one would have ever known about it. Of course, this raises an interesting question. In Virginia's comments about Mel, she made it pretty clear that not only did she not think much of him, she thought he was terrible at his job as well. In statements from other investigators who had worked with Mel both previously and at the time of his disappearance, they described him as quiet, withdrawn, and not very social. I can't help but wonder, is it possible the reason Mel might not have wanted to hang out was because people were going through his garbage on a daily basis and trying to get him fired? I know that sounds like a silly question to ask, but throughout this entire episode, there seemed to be one consistent piece of information. The only people who had anything negative to say about Mel were David Yates, who would replace him as chief, his wife Virginia, who had tried to get Mel fired, or at least wanted to, and Detective Bigham. Curiously, Bigham seems to bounce back and forth between praising Mel and criticizing him. He was weird, he was quiet, he didn't hang out, he wasn't a good cop, he wrote lewd stories, he cut his own hair, he wasn't a good writer. This is all what is said about him while the investigation is going on. Not exactly the kind of people I'd want trying to solve my disappearance. One piece of this case that I've seen mentioned, though only sparingly, has to do with what we know about Mel and what he was writing. Everything we've got about that comes from a handful of sources. Virginia Yates and what she says she pulled out of the garbage. Mel's ex-wife, who says she found a lewd story he'd written, and Detective Bigham, who presumably was given copies of these writings. The questions being posited by many was, how can you be certain anything that supposedly came out of that trash can or from Mel's typewriter is actually legitimate? If the argument is that Mel went out of his way to construct all these different angles and clues, the note about the dry cleaner, the apartment key in his desk, the story to Judy Easter, the clothes in the car, the schedules in his pocket, why would you simply assume that anything pulled off the ribbon wasn't just another angle he was working? How can you, with any confidence, believe any of the letter as it was pulled from the ribbon when you can't even confirm who had possession of or access to that ribbon in the days leading up to his disappearance? Even former trustee Josephine Becks commented that too many people had access to Mel's typewriter to take anything from that ribbon seriously. Then, of course, there's another possibility, one I haven't seen anyone talking about. We know Mel was a prankster. We know he was a writer, and based on the statements of Mary Kirby, he had a flair for creating fake stories and ads, which he posted on a bulletin board in K&K Donuts. Now, Mel was far from a dumb man, despite what some of these people might have you believe. He was sharp, knew his job well, and certainly paid close attention to the people around him. What are the chances he was unaware that Virginia had been going through his trash for the previous year? Certainly, he might not have known, but the possibility exists that someone told him, that he saw Virginia doing it, or he figured it out another way. I've always been curious as to whether or not Mel covered up his typewriter when anyone other than Virginia Yates walked into the office. Regardless, if this guy was so paranoid about what he was typing that he covered it up when people walked by, would he also be so secure in just tossing those writings in the trash can where anyone could find them? Especially if he picked up on the fact that Virginia wanted to know what he was doing on that typewriter. While it's never been discussed by investigators, I can't help but wonder, isn't it entirely possible that the papers Mel was putting in that trash can were by design? Like maybe one giant prank on Virginia herself? Unfortunately, there's no way to know. Another curious point here, Mel had a typewriter at home. Did they check that ribbon, find nothing on it, or had that ribbon already been removed? So the theory as presented by investigators goes as follows. Mel Wiley, frustrated with everything about his life, begins putting a plan together. He works out the details and decides where he's going, when he's doing it, and how he's going to get away clean. He then begins removing important items from his desk at work, piece by piece, hoping to go unnoticed. He fails at this. He cleans out his desk drawer and leaves a key to his apartment. He writes a note to himself about laundry and leaves it to be found by investigators. He cleans out his fridge and packs a bag with most of his long-sleeve shirts, his book of poetry, and the manuscript to his novel. He tells Judy Easter the bizarre story about swimming at Edgewater Park. He leaves a cab schedule and a handwritten Greyhound schedule in his uniform pocket so it can be found later. He drives up to the park, arranges the clothing on the passenger seat along with the towel and the suntan lotion. He leaves his wallet, badge, and police ID in the glove box. He locks the car and walks away. Maybe to the Amtrak station across the street, maybe into a waiting cab, or possibly onto a Greyhound bus. For some reason, while he left the key to his apartment behind, he locks up the car and doesn't leave a key to that, forcing the window to be broken. He does all of this, plans out his escape so meticulously that it takes them several days before they even begin putting it together. But he forgets about his work typewriter, or it simply doesn't occur to him that they would go through the ribbon. Even though his mother has already lost one son, he's willing to deprive her of another by disappearing and never contacting any of his family members ever again. This seems to be in direct contradiction to the letter pulled from the ribbon, in which he wrote that he wasn't trying to hurt anyone. There's no way he'd have believed his family and friends would not be hurt by his random disappearance. So, he's smart enough to pull this off, but not smart enough to think of the typewriter. According to Detective Bigham, given Mel's years in law enforcement and the 3 years he spent in military intelligence, if anyone is capable of assuming a new identity and disappearing, it's Mel Wiley. Yet apparently money wasn't a major part of Mel's plans. We know he probably left with a couple of $1,000s, but he left more than 4 times that amount behind, which raises another question for which there has never been sufficient answers. Even if Mel hated his job, didn't like Ohio, wanted to get away, loved California, he had less than 3 years left until he could retire and get his full pension. Surely, he could have pushed himself to make it to the end and then head out of town with a pocket full of cash. But he doesn't. Why? We find ourselves left with the same mystery that investigators faced that Tuesday morning in July of 1985 when Mel's car was found at Edgewater Park. Admittedly, almost all of the evidence in this case points towards the likelihood that Mel left of his own volition. However, this case was also investigated from that perspective. So what information that may have led down a different path, or what angles that may have told a different story were missed or outright ignored, we'll never know. I've tried for weeks to wrap my head around this case, to try and understand just what in the hell happened here. Given the writings that are attributed to Mel, his lack of contact with family members over the years, and his seeming lack of concern for money, a vehicle, or a place to live, there's really only one angle that fits. Sure, you could say Mel set off for California to finally write his novel, fall in love with a group of artistic people like himself, and live the rest of his happy life writing and exploring the Bay Area. However, I do think there's a darker possibility. If you look at what Mel apparently wrote in that final letter, there is one excerpt that stands out to me more than the rest. It reads, quote, "By the time you receive this, I will, in a sense, have gone away. Fortunately or unfortunately, it's a one-way trip, so I'm told, with no possibility of ever returning." End quote. Does this sound to you like the words of a man who is moving across the country to start a new life, or maybe planning to put an end to his old life? There's no way of knowing for certain, but I tend to fall into the group of people who believe that the only way Mel would have left behind everything and everyone he loved without a goodbye, without ever contacting them again, may have been because his plan wasn't to go to California and begin again. It was to take himself out of this world. As Detective Bigham said at one point, quote, "You have to assume he took himself out of the picture." End quote. To me, that's the darkest core of this case, the gaping maw that hangs open but refuses to respond. What if Mel Wiley didn't write the ending he dreamed of? What if he didn't construct his own disappearance to move on with his life? What if everything he had done was designed purely to protect those he loved from the truth? His life wasn't what he wanted. His job wasn't what he wanted. He never made it as a writer. He couldn't be with the woman he loved. Maybe one of those dark, lonely nights, sitting at his typewriter, Chief Wiley decided there wasn't a reason to keep going. Maybe while those charged with finding him were destroying his reputation, they were actually spitting on his grave. Maybe if anyone he had worked with had taken a moment to stop criticizing him and to ask him if he was all right, maybe it would have been different. But what do you believe? Did Mel Wiley run off, move to California and spend his days writing and meeting new and interesting people? Or is it more likely that either by his own hand or that of someone with something to gain, Mel Wiley breathed his last breath before his car was ever found in that park along the shores of Lake Erie? Maybe, in desperation, choking on pain and emptiness, Mel Wiley made the choice to write his own ending and to make it a permanent one. Maybe there's a John Doe out there, unidentified and laid beneath an unmarked grave, who will one day be identified as Chief Wiley. Or perhaps Chief Wiley is still out there somewhere, 84 years old and living a happy life, spending his days with friends and his nights writing his heart away. Maybe he even occasionally checks in on his own story, wondering if anyone's cracked it yet. Or maybe we'll never know the truth, as without more information, the discovery of Mel's body or Mel himself raising his hand and saying, "Here I am," the vanishing of Chief Wiley will remain unsolved and ice cold. If you're looking for more information about the vanishing of Chief Mel Wiley, there are many websites and forums discussing his case, although the details tend to be rather thin. For this episode, the most helpful sources were the Akron Beacon Journal, Los Angeles Times, and the Plain Dealer. Mel has a page with the Charlie Project, Doe Network, and NamUs, where he can be found as MP38896. If you have any information about the vanishing of Chief Wiley, please contact the Hinckley Township Police Department at 330-278-7161. You can also call the Medina County Sheriff's Office at 330-725-0028. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to thank our amazing Patreon producers: Alicia Lorraine, Andrew Guarino, Ann Bertram, Camelia Tyler, Christine Greco, Danny Renee, Daerthy, Denise Dingsdale, Diane Dyson, Eloanne Meyer, Fabulous TT, Guillermo Pinto, Jennifer Winkler, Julie A. Mangano, Justin Snyder, Kara Moreland, K.Y., Lars Jensen Fangel, Leslie B., Madison Lahoulier, Marla Wright, Melissa Breckeisen, Nick Mohar Shores, Sarah Lyons, Travis Skepko, Stacy Finnegan, Stephanie Joyner, Stephanie Eve, Tiffany Nelson, and Tom Radford. Without your amazing support, this show would not be possible, so thank you all so much for contributing to Trace Evidence. One quick reminder, if you're planning on attending CrimeCon this year in Orlando, Florida, use promo code TRACE at crimecon.com to save 10% off your pass. Once again, that's promo code TRACE at crimecon.com. If you're interested in learning more about this case or other cases featured on the show, please visit trace-evidence.com. There you can find case breakdowns, all social media links, merchandise shops, case descriptions, media, and options for donating, including PayPal and Patreon, should you wish to support the show. This concludes our look into the vanishing of Chief Melvin Wiley. I want to thank you again for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.